Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, I rise to talk about one of the most extraordinary report tabling incidents in my 11 years in the Tasmanian Parliament. Mr Deputy Speaker, this morning the Custody Inspection Report, Inspection of Youth Custodial Services in Tasmania 2018, undertaken by the Custodial Inspector, Mr Richard Connick, who also happens to be the Ombudsman, was tabled in the Tasmanian Parliament. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, in a circumstance that I have not seen in a report that's been tabled in the Parliament, multiple redactions are made to Mr Connick's report and also to his recommendations. And the Minister, Mr Yench, needs to explain what has happened here. Because, unfortunately for the person who did the redactions, this is a story of two blacks. It's the story of words being highlighted in black, basically, and then printed where you can see the words underneath the redaction. So what we know from this attempt to cover up how disastrous the situation is at the Ashley Youth Detention Centre, when you go and read underneath the black, is that, for example, there is no metal detector or screening at the gate for contraband or for weapons. The custodial inspector noted how the ease with which it is possible to bring drugs into Ashley Youth Detention Centre, that systems to prevent young people from, quote, unlawfully leaving the centre undetected, that is, escape, inadequate, that there is inadequate security coverage of the facility, that there are multiple blind spots of cameras that are there to monitor the perimeter, that young people there are unsafe, not secure, Mr Deputy Speaker. And for some reason things have been redacted like I find this really hard to understand. The inspection team was advised that young people are, black box, searched. Now, when you go underneath the black box, the word there is pat. So a decision has been made to redact the word pat from this document. We really need an explanation from the Minister. There's also been another recommendation made about how to make sure that the centre is preventing contraband from entering and leaving the site. The report notes that Ashley Youth Detention staff are not alcohol and drug tested, Mr Deputy Speaker, and as we know, in utter madness, middle managers at Hobart City Council are alcohol and drug tested, yet this government can't get itself together to make sure that the people who are dealing with highly vulnerable, disadvantaged young people who find themselves in Ashley for a whole range of reasons cannot bring itself, hasn't been able to organise itself to make sure that people working in that centre with those kids are drug and alcohol tested. Oh, we also find when we go underneath the black, Mr Deputy Speaker, that visitors to the centre are not searched. Contractors and vehicles are not searched. There are no background checks on contractors who go into Ashley Youth Detention Centre, where we are talking about children between the age of 10 and 18. Mr Deputy Speaker, the report notes the risk to the safety of staff and residents. It notes that there is no register of contraband, and also that staff said no contraband had been found when it became clear that there'd been no searches for contraband. Mr Deputy Speaker, and on it goes underneath the redactions, a damning indictment on the management of Ashley Youth Detention Centre, and it sits on the head of this minister and indeed, regrettably, the entire government, because as we know, in 2016 a report was handed down into the options for the future of Ashley Youth Detention Centre, which is ineffective, doesn't have a proper therapeutic model, Mr Deputy Speaker, and is highly expensive. And the preferred option, of course, was to close down Ashley and to develop a more therapeutic and responsive model to young people. What did the government do? Ignored the report for 2 years, and just before the last state election, to shore up those votes in Northern Lions and around Deloraine, decided to keep the Ashley Youth Detention Centre going. Mr Deputy Speaker, there's a couple of issues that are raised by these redactions. Why? Why has the Custodial Inspector's report been so heavily redacted? Who redacted that report? And there's a question about the lawfulness of these redactions, because the report is made possible through the Custodial Inspector Act of 2016. Section 25, offences against inspector, state this: a person must not A, without reasonable excuse, wilfully obstruct, hinder, resist or threaten the inspector or an officer of the inspector in the performance of functions under this Act. So if you highlight the key words, without reasonable excuse, wilfully hinder the inspector in the performance of functions under this Act, there is a legitimate question, Mr Deputy Speaker, about the decision-making matrix behind redacting this damning report. Mr Deputy Speaker, there is no question it is the same today as it was in 2016, and prior to that, the Ashley Youth Detention Centre must be closed. Mr Deputy Speaker, at any given time there are 8 to 10 young people in there. It costs the taxpayers around $8 to $10 million a year, and we are churning young people out of Ashley straight into Risdon Prison. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a bad model. It's a failed model. We have a policy that we've developed, that we took to the last election, that's based on the evidence around the Missouri model, where you have a therapeutic approach to youth justice, so you make sure that you're giving those kids the best possible chance in life and you are keeping the community safer. I don't understand, Mr Deputy Speaker, why the Minister hasn't come into Parliament and explained why there's been such an attempt to cover up the real situation at Ashley Youth Detention Centre. I hear on the news that the Minister was unaware of the redactions in this report that he tabled this morning. He tabled that report this morning, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, I know how this stuff works. Okay, sometimes there's a report sitting on your chair for tabling, but you certainly should have looked at it, and it is a damning indictment on the Minister and regrettably on the agency, because someone somewhere has tried to cover up the situation at Ashley.
Yeah.